the the Bickle. Yeah. Really good.
Because it was really, everyone was very open.
Yeah, Joe was good and it was very collaborative. That's what we can do to bring together. Well, good afternoon everyone joining us here. If I can invite you all to take your seats. And that includes all those people that are joining via the live stream. I understand there are 600 people registered there, so even more, or far more than there are in this room today here in London. But thank you for joining Alliance's magazine's 2023 Year in Philanthropy event. It's an event that we do to wrap up and reflect on the year that we've had and key themes in philanthropy. I'm Charles Keidan, the executive editor of Alliance, publication, as you know, which covers philanthropy worldwide. And on behalf of everyone in the Alliance team here today and our trustees, we want to extend a warm welcome to you in the room and joining via the live stream. The format for today's event will have an opening session which will include an expert panel looking at two key themes in philanthropy this year: equity, diversity and inclusion on the one hand, and separately, although there will be intersections, the impact of new technologies such as artificial intelligence, the impact they have both on our field but also our society at large. And then after a short break, there'll be a special Alliance workshop looking at the year in philanthropy through the 4 special features we've published this year, the latest of which is this one here, looking at whether philanthropy should be more political or not. The other special features this year are on transforming philanthropy, new giving vehicles and tools, and philanthropy's contribution or lack thereof to the Sustainable Development Goals. So that will be an in-person workshop for all of you that are in the room in London. But before we begin, I just want to thank Mercer, our friends and colleagues at Mercer who are sponsoring today's event, and also extend a warm welcome to Paul Fleming, who's here from Mercer, just to say a few words.
30 seconds, if that's all right.
Thank
you so much. A wonderful event again. I haven't seen many of you in about a year since the last event in North London. But thanks to our organisers. It's always a fantastic event, great forum, great exchange, some friendly faces that I've seen and not caught up with enough. Mercer, we are investment advisors. At the core, I head up the endowments business in the UK. What do? We advise clients ultimately where to invest their money for hopefully lots of return to do better things for people and planet. We have a mainstream of investments, but we also have a career stream. Roll in my colleague who has joined us from the career side, and they advise on all things DEI, well, there's a whole host of things, and you should really take advantage of that today and pick Callie's brains on all things relating to employment and so forth, a whole host of services. Completely different stream that I head up, but anything investment, AI, DEI, please do reach out. We support clients in governance and questions. It's not really all about making money on investments and social impact investing. Sometimes there's some simple questions that we can answer very easily. So reach out and email, anything we can do. Victoria is also here from the investment side if you've got any questions. If anyone's been following AI this year in investments, if you've been invested in it, you've probably done very well. If you've not been invested in it, you've probably not done very well. But we're always happy to have our brains picked on anything investment related. But thank you again to our organisers. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to seeing lovely faces again. Have a great Christmas and New Year when it comes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to Mercer for being a long-standing colleague, partner and supporter of Alliance and its work trying to foster global conversation in philanthropy. Before we turn to our panellists, so we're just going to start with some audience polls. So we want to invite people here in the room to use the QR code on the screen or follow the URL. And those on the live stream, you can use the link in the chat. And the first question is just actually for the people that are streaming in live, and that's just to say which country you're joining us from today. We're a global philanthropy publication, so we typically have people from all corners of the world, but let's see where people are coming in from today. Welcome to all of you. Can you?
Are our heads in the way?
Am I in the way? Or does the technology work? That's the second question.
There's another one.
Excuse me. Okay, apparently the answers can be seen from somewhere, just not here at the moment. So we're going to move on to questions for everybody. Just first, some questions on equity, diversity and inclusion. The first, and most of these are binary answers because they enable us to get a bit of a snapshot in terms of what you're thinking on these questions. So the first is, do you believe that improvements to foundation EDI practices go far enough? And the second question, which I think we'll move on to in a moment, is do you believe that EDI quotas are part of the solution? So that is a mandatory requirement to actually require an organisation to make a specific change to its composition. That could be for the board or senior management. You can interpret that question how you want. So at the moment, around 70% are saying that quotas should be or are part of the solution, and about 30% saying no. We're going to go on to the next question, which is another big topic in equity, diversity, inclusion debates in the philanthropy sphere, is around whether investigating sources of philanthropic wealth and making reparations should be more mainstream as a conversation. There are foundations that are now investigating the sources of their wealth, getting historians to look at those questions, and in some cases thinking about reparations. There seems to be an emphatic view at the moment that yes, they should be more mainstream. And the final question which we'll move to is, and this is actually not a yes or no question, but this is inviting your thoughts, is what changes to foundation practices should be prioritised in this area? Of course, that might include quotas, but it might include many other things. So feel free, we'll just spend a minute on this, just getting your kind of perspectives on that. So transparency is coming up on the screen. Reporting on diversity, public board oversight, collaboration, but more involvement of grassroots. So what does involving grassroots communities and people mean in relation to the foundation leadership management boards? Investigating sources of wealth. More bottom-up approach. More participatory approach, so again around inclusion. Avoiding tokenism, so maybe representation does not equal equity. More self-critical approach, and someone said, talking of a favourite topic of me at Alliance in recent months, increasing payouts, so mandatory payouts from foundations as a proportion of their income. So there's no requirement in most parts of the world for foundations to pay out any money other than just fulfil their charitable purposes, but in the US, Canada and Australia there's a payout requirement of 5%, so debates which we think might follow in the European context about payouts. And lived experience, people with lived experience. So those are all questions that we can return to on the EDI lens later on in the panel. But thank you all for your perspectives on that. We're going to turn to some questions now, just some audience polls about the impact of new technologies such as artificial intelligence. So moving to that slide, what positives are there in the world with new technologies such as AI? Just again, writing in the word cloud some of your immediate reactions about what is positive. So on the screen we're seeing more efficiency, It can mean greater access. So these technologies can create greater access. They can save time. They can analyze information. It can lead to innovations in health. New ways of working. We've certainly seen that in the last few years. The Alliance team, for example, work from home 2 days a week and from the office on the other days, or rather vice versa. I'm sure that might be the same for some of your organisations, taking advantage of those new technologies. Upskilling, understanding data, less repetitive tasks. Helps to gather, new technologies help to gather feedback more effectively. More time and more opportunities for diversity. So these are some of the positives or potential positives that you in the room and in the live stream are identifying. We're now going to move to some of the negatives. So what negatives are there in the world with new technologies such as AI? So again, using the word cloud, let's get a picture of your thoughts. Bias, plagiarism, misinformation. Environmental impacts of new technologies could be negative. Ethical risks, non-diverse data, and misinformation seems to be front and centre, along with negative bias in some of the answers. Risks of exclusion, increasing inequality, deep fakes, cybercrime, hate and negativity. An increase in the digital gap and the manipulation of data. Thank you. I mean, that's really instructive just to get a perspective on some of the positives and negatives as we start to think about this conversation and the role of philanthropy. And now we're just going to turn to two final questions on this segment. And that first is, should philanthropy be funding research to help make artificial intelligence work for people and society? And again, it's a yes and no. And one of the guests that I'm about to introduce, I'm sure, will be heartened to hear that philanthropy should indeed, according to the respondents, be funding research. That's just 9 out of 10 of you are saying yes to that so far. Yep, about that. And then finally, the final question, should philanthropy be funding legal actions to challenge the abuses of power by big technology companies? So not just the research role, but the activism role of philanthropy. And again, a high percentage saying yes. And it would be interesting to note that if there is such an emphatic view that philanthropy should indeed be funding research and indeed legal actions, how does that correlate with the actual direction of current philanthropic funding? So thank you for kicking off. I'm in silence, but busily working on your computer phones to provide those answers. So with that, I'm now going to move to our panel. We were hoped to be joined by Kenny Imafidon from Clearview Research, but unfortunately a family bereavement means he's not able to be here. But I am absolutely delighted to have two expert panelists sitting either side of me. On my left here, Rosa Curling, she's a founder of Foxglove, a philanthropy-backed organisation that is making a name for itself, taking legal action and running campaigns against the abuses of power by big technology companies. There's no one better to be talking about these issues than colleagues at Foxglove. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Rosa. And then to my right, we have Tim Gardam. He is the Chief Executive of the Nuffield Foundation, one of the UK's leading and most thoughtful foundations. And amongst many other things that the Nuffield Foundation have done, they established the Ada Lovelace Institute in 2018. And the aim of that institute was to ensure that the benefits of data and artificial intelligence are equitably distributed and responsibly used by government, public sector bodies and others. With that in mind, just a very brief framing on this question of artificial intelligence and new technologies, that I've observed two kind of parallel frameworks for the philanthropy conversation on this topic. One is about how our sector can make better use of the opportunities that are presented by AI, better grant making, data sharing, some of the positives you're seeing on the screen. But then there's this wider question about philanthropy using its resources to regulate and restrain big technology companies in some cases, or at least provide research that can inform public discourse about it. So that is why we have Tim and Rosa here to really reflect on these questions. So I'll start with Tim. Tell us a little bit about the Nuffield Foundation and its how it became involved in these issues.
Well, in one way, it may be seen as a bit of a surprise insofar as we're a bit of a venerable foundation, really, founded back in the 1940s. And our focus has, for many years, been social science, really, social policy, economics, education. And
Can you speak up a little bit just for the people?
Can you hear me back? I'll try and shout.
Yes.
We have always been interested in the implications of scientific advance on people in society, and we funded, back in 1991, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, at a time when genetics was clearly understanding what genetics was going to do to bioscience and medicine, and how that was going to be framed in terms of its impacts on patients and patient relationships. There was no forum to do that. Interestingly, 30 years later, still funded by us, also now co-funded by Wellcome and by the Medical Research Council, it is the national advisory body on bioethics in the UK, and unlike in Europe or anywhere else, it's independent. It's not funded by government, which I think gives it a particular power. 2016, when I turned up as Chief Executive of Nuffield, didn't know much about this. What I did know was it seemed to me that if I looked across all our research on disadvantage, on education, on pathways to opportunity, on vulnerabilities, on skills, that the impacts of digital technologies on these issues was exponential. And yet if you looked at the research agendas, you could look at all the researchers coming in from the various different departments in the universities, and it was as if digital technologies was research somewhere else. Data science was over there, social science was over there. So it seemed to me that there was an urgency to try and find a means of bringing the thinking on what data science and AI was going to do to people in society to the fore. And at that time, there was an awful lot going on. There was a big Royal Society, British Academy report the government had commissioned into the implications for data governance of AI, and that ended up suggesting setting up the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation in government. My view was there was always going to be need for something independent, and actually I think that's been borne out insofar as the CDI has been sort of gobbled up into government to become much more an agent for encouraging innovation, and the E of ethics has rather dropped out. What I think was important for us was that, one, this wasn't just going to be something that the foundation would do. We're a responsive funder. We should be sitting there, standing back, letting good ideas come to us. But what we thought we could do was corral other interests, and we brought together in the same room Wellcome, industry, people like Royal Society, Royal Statistical Society, and scoped out what an Ada-type data ethics institute might look like. And I think it's an advantage of our independence that, bluntly, my trustees, slightly madly, on the basis of a 5-page document, gave us £5 million to get on with it. I think the two key things that happened was, one, setting up this advisory board and then setting up a sort of founding board. We decided not to make ethics centre stage, because if you do that, you tend to get into a world where people spend their entire time dancing around protocols and principles and theory. And the executive chair, who had actually just come from setting up the Turing, said, look, what this is about the impact of digital technologies and artificial intelligence on people in society. And our first director, and it took us a long time to find the right person, we found this brilliant person, Carly Kind, who's just leaving actually because, and this is a real accolade for Ada, that after 4 years, its first director has been appointed by the Australian government to be its first privacy commissioner, which is an extraordinary thing to happen on the basis of what Ada's done. But Carly said, the real and only question that Ada needs to ask is this: what will a good society look like when AI is working in its interests? And so we didn't want to just focus on harms and risks, but to try and think, what is the basis whereby artificial intelligence leads to a society that works well for everybody in it? And that, I think, was where we got to. The other thing I would say, just in foundation terms, what we did do, we set up Ada inside the foundation. Now that might seem a rather odd thing to do, but it was based on the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. What it did mean we could incubate something, that essentially all the stuff you need to set up an institute, the building, the governance, the audit, the finance, the HR, the foundation would take care of that. And in this space, we could put some really clever people to get on with it. And it's found its way. It's very different to what I thought it would be, but it's an example of, I think, what any independent foundation with, we're lucky we've got a decent endowment, can do if your timing's right. A lot of things we've found don't go right, but this one did go right, I think, because the timing was right.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction to the birth of the Ada Lovelace Institute and what its aims were. Just two questions, if I may. First is about that balance between grant making and operating, which for the foundation community is a real interesting question that many foundations, particularly in the UK and US, are set up as grant making institutions. But you've actually got a model where much of your work is grant making, but you've also got these operating institutes within the foundation. How do you decide the balance between the two?
Well, we're spending about £17.5 million a year in total on grants, of which £2.5 million are internal grants. So 15 million a year minimum is going in third-party grants. We also spend quite a lot of money on ourselves, to be honest, doing quite a lot of synthesis work, because the nature of this academic type of work we do is you get lots of grants on particularities, but sometimes we can pull them together and produce something which, by synthesizing the material, leads to greater impact in terms of policy and regulators. And people haven't got time to read through all the academic stuff, but can pull out the significance of it. So, but basically, the one thing I think a grant maker and a foundation must always be aware of is just because you've got the cash doesn't mean you've got the ideas. And if you try to be too directing, the good people don't come near you because they think they're going to be told what to do. What I do think, though, in this field, it has been quite interesting how, in some of our really big, impressive grants, I'm thinking, you probably saw a lot of it in the press last week, the Resolution Foundation's work called Stagnation Nation. We funded that. The Deaton Review on Aspects of Inequality in the 21st Century, we funded that. There's not a chapter in Deaton, it's a magisterial piece of work. There's not one chapter on digital inequalities. If you look at what Resolution have been talking about there's no one chapter there on implications of AI for society. It's quite interesting that that sort of public social policy and the economists' perspectives don't intersect naturally with the data scientists' perspectives. And so we haven't had many ideas coming to us on this theme. And I think that's a problem.
And just taking a step back and just bearing in mind your outgoing director who's going to take up that important role in Australia and her challenge about the vision for the Institute being about actually making AI work for people and society. How far do you think you've begun to even start to achieve that aim? I mean, what would impact look like? Have you got some standout examples of work that you've done where you think that public benefit has been demonstrated?
Hope so. First big piece of work we did was on biometrics and facial recognition. And I think that we launched into the pandemic. So something which had been very in the news disappears. But they kept going at it. And actually I think that work will have a longer term impact because it has framed the arguments. More immediately, it was interesting that when COVID hit, I think it was a test case for all of us. Here, the work that Ada did on track and trace apps and how effective they were, how well they were being used, what were the implications of that was quite remarkable. The institution had been going a year. They were called in to see Michael go because of that evidence. It showed how little of this work was going on. That was the point. I think if I had a critique of Ada, and I said this to them, so I don't mind saying to you, it has been brilliantly successful. But because of the nature of the AI debate, it takes you into quite an elite space. It takes you into quite a technocratic space. So if you're going to talk to Europe about AI regulation, and Ada ended up putting someone into Brussels to have traction there, and the need to involve people in those decisions, you get into a particular type of language. If you're talking about the AI regulation white paper to the UK government, you go into a particular world and a particular idiom. I think the challenge, which no one's really getting yet, is to look at these issues through the other end of the periscope, so to speak, starting in the schools, in the hospitals, and the housing estates, and saying what is happening to people's lives as a result of these technologies, which may alter their opportunities, give some extraordinary opportunities, but at the same time constrain. We're not looking at it in those perspectives. The AI conversation tends to be about AI. It doesn't tend to be about what's going on every day on the ground with people who are not in the least interested in this.
Well, we'll hold that thought because that will be a perfect entry in a moment to Rosa. Before we do, I just want to ask if there's some questions from all of you here, just a couple of questions that you want to pose to Tim, either about the Nuffield Foundation's model of the Ada Lovelace Institute or any other questions. We'll just go to you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Caroline Fines, and I've worked in philanthropy for a long time. And so I was interested that you said that good AI and data proposals are not coming to you at Nuffield, which is kind of interesting because there's a huge amount of work going on and energy going on in AI and data. And I wondered what your hypothesis is as to why those are not coming to foundations. I mean, it could be, for example, that they're just different worlds and that lots of data people just don't think about foundations and they don't think about writing paper applications.
Well, I think the problem I'm setting out is slightly different. It is that the way the people who are working on AI and are working on data-driven technologies are interested in those data-driven technologies. If you look at an area like, we have one exception to this, I think, is health, where there is a lot of work going on about the use of AI in critical infrastructure and the health service. I think one of the big issues, probably the most central issue to Nuffield, should be how will AI change and make more robust our collapsing public services and public sector. That is probably the biggest issue before us. Because essentially health, education, justice, welfare systems, social care are all creaking at the seams and failing us. You only have to look at the projections of spend to realise they're unsustainable, just in basic macroeconomic terms. So how will technology interventions, can they enable us to maintain universal provision in areas where universal provision now seems impossible? That is one of the really difficult questions. Now to do that, you need the data scientists who tend to be interested in solutions, talking to the social scientists who understand the wicked questions. And those are fundamental different ways of thinking. And so it may sound rather an academic point, but if you can't, and there are very few places, institutionally or in the academy, where that's going on. Southampton, it certainly is, the Web Science Institute. At Cambridge, the Bennett Institute, it is. But there are not many other places where if you go and talk to people who are really interested in child welfare, they're also thinking about AI. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you. And the data sciences and the social sciences and philanthropy. So there's an equation to consider. But to help us consider it, I'm also delighted to have Rosa Curling, as I mentioned, from Foxglove, who is tackling for our organisation a different piece of the same conundrum, which is actually more centred on some of the ethical questions and the overreach of the big technology companies. So you trained as a lawyer at Lee Day, and then you shifted with colleagues to set up Foxglove. Can you tell us what precipitated that shift and where you've got to?
Yeah, of course. So, so as Charles says, I was a public lawyer at Lee Day.
Just speak up a little bit for.
I will try and project. Having been trained as a solicitor, I always feel embarrassed about my failure to be a barrister-like speaker. So I trained at Lee Day as a public lawyer, challenging government decisions. which I did for well over a decade, and I did a lot of work with both my co-founders, Corey and Martha, looking at the abuses that were happening in the name of the war on terror. And did a lot of work after the disclosure of Edward Snowden about the collection of data, the processing of data, the sharing of data, and did a lot of legal challenges about the government use, and in particular Secret Service use of data, to do with the kind of mass interception of all of our data. And one of the things I think that became increasingly apparent to both Corey, myself and Martha was while government was collecting a huge amount of data about us all, actually the company's data about us all was way, way, way bigger. And this had happened almost, well certainly without me taking enough notice of it. And we decided to set up Foxglove as a non-profit litigation company that is trying to challenge both the government use of data and technology, which is abusive and exploitative, but also the companies. And we felt very strongly that there were lots of kind of internal ethical panels happening in, Meta or in Google Alphabet, and actually absolutely no one was suing them. And there was a lot of conversations about privacy, which is wonderful and incredibly important, but actually there was a lack of conversation about the power that these companies now have over us. Because I think these companies are now dictating our public squares, they are massively involved in our economies, we find the people that we have relationships with, we find our jobs, and the internet is everywhere and technology is everywhere and it's within our lives and it dominates our lives. And actually the power is held in the handful of corporations. And it's so interesting to hear kind of what Tim was saying about Ada, and Ada is that kind of role in terms of trying to figure out how to do this ethically is incredibly important. Because there is nothing inevitable about how the technology is developed. These are decisions that are taken by corporations. And sadly, many of those decisions, which are of course driven by their profit needs and desires, have horrendous implications for our communities. And maybe just to give you a kind of worked example of something that we've been working on, I was talking to somebody as I walked through the door about AI, and we mentioned ChatGPT. ChatGPT, this new kind of vogue, exciting, revolutionary tool, which it may well be, but it's also something that I think we really need to look at and be aware of. So the way that Foxglove has been looking at ChatGPT is in part through to look to see what they're doing in terms of their workers. So in terms of the people who are in fact working for the company and whose labour the company is absolutely dependent on. So ChatGPT, as I'm sure you all know, you type something in and then you get a kind of lovely array of kind of paragraphs and answers in response. And ChatGPT is created in part through software and very kind of clever engineers who kind of sweep up the internet, and from that build up this huge amount of content and data, which is then used to provide the answers that we're looking for. What is not discussed is the fact that actually there is a huge workforce as well. There are called data labelers or content moderators that OpenAI, the company, and Microsoft has just massively brought into it, is absolutely dependent on. And so when we looked at OpenAI, we looked to see that in fact this kind of mythology or story that the tech companies had told us, that this was a kind of a unicorn, this kind of one extraordinary engineer who'd managed to think up this wonderful piece of technology and it was going to revolutionize the world, and they tend to be kind of wealthy white men in Silicon Valley, let's be honest, and whether it's Twitter or Meta or Google or OpenAI, that actually this story is much more complicated. And there actually is a huge amount of work that is ignored and is kind of hidden behind the work. So we looked to see what was happening in relation to ChatGPT, and it became increasingly clear, and there was some wonderful investigative journalist work done about this for the Time magazine, that actually there was a huge group of workers in Kenya who were subcontracted to basically clean up the hate that OpenAI was bringing. Because what was happening is that when you typed in your question, quite often what would come out, because of the source of where that data is, which is kind of scraped off all of the internet, which obviously has a huge amount of toxic content, quite often what you would get back is really kind of horrific hate speech and racism and awful kind of content. And so, of course, what then had to happen is the company needed to invest in people to basically clean that content up. And these individuals were outsourced. They went to Kenya. They were paid about $2 an hour to report and expose and kind of make sure that the traumatic content, which would normally come to us, was kind of cleaned and prevented from coming to us. And they had no proper psychological support or care or anything at all. So what Foxglove decided to do in this space was to try and support data labelers and content moderators. And we've done a lot of work with Meta, Facebook content moderators in Kenya. And what we try to do is use litigation. So as I said, we felt like there weren't people, in fact, suing the companies. And so we've used litigation as a kind of vehicle through which to try and create change. And our litigation is slightly unusual because it doesn't always request damages. And that's a very considered, conscious decision by us, which I can talk a little bit further about. But actually what we always demand through litigation is behavioural changes from the company. And that's what feels so crucial, is that in fact, these companies, they're not, there needs to be a demand from them to make these changes. And the way Foxglove has been trying to work is to use litigation like this in Kenya to say, actually, these individuals have working rights. There are clear labour laws in Kenya that the companies have to follow. They have the right to join a union. They have a right to proper health and safety working conditions and proper wages. And those are the kind of issues that we've been trying to highlight, bring into the public domain to kind of show the way in which the power of these companies is having real harm on individuals' lives. And of course, there is a horrible kind of discriminatory nature of that work too, that we've been kind of trying to highlight through the court process.
Can you say a bit more about that discriminatory element?
Sure. So let's look at Meta. So we know through Frances Haugen and the Facebook files that were disclosed last year, or maybe even, last year, that Facebook has made a decision to invest 87% of its misinformation budget. So on kind of making sure that what is published on its platform is as accurate as possible, is as least kind of hate-filled and racist-filled as possible. They spend 87% of their budget on the US and Canada, and they spend 13% on what they call rest of world, which I just think is a lovely little additional kind of neo-colonial slant to that fact. And we only know that because Frances Haugen had the courage to speak out. I mean, the secrecy, the kind of culture of fear that these companies have very successfully created in their workforce means that this information never comes out unless someone speaks. Because government, to be frank, have been asleep at the wheel and not regulating these companies in the way that's needed. So that gives you, I think, a really stark example of that approach. And what that means, of course, and we're doing a case about this also, you go somewhere like Ethiopia, where there was a horrific conflict, 600,000 people died. The platform was awash with hate speech and incitement to violence. And it was awash because Facebook had chosen not to train its algorithm in any of the 85 local languages spoken in Ethiopia. So when something was published online, the algorithm didn't have the language skills, it hadn't been trained in the language needed to pick up on the hate speech and remove it from the platform. And Facebook had chosen to employ 25 content moderators for a population of 117 million in 3 of those 85 languages. So that things are bad here. I'm not in any way suggesting that we've got things right here. There's still massive problems here with the way in which the companies choose to curate these social media platforms. These are corporate decisions about curation. But if you go somewhere like Ethiopia, it is so much worse. And our client, one of our clients who's taking this case against Meta, his father was a Tigrayan, very, very eminent professor in Ethiopia, who was basically doxed on Facebook. There were 2 posts kind of calling him out as a Tigrayan basically like a death threat to him. His son reported these posts to Facebook, which is one of the options when something appears and is published on Facebook and you're worried or concerned that it's inciting or kind of hate speech. You can report it. His son reported it repeatedly, and Facebook didn't remove it. 2 weeks after the second one was published, his father was killed outside his house, bled to death over the course of 8 hours. Exactly the same language that was on the Facebook post was used when he was, by the people who attacked him and killed him. So, and this is a man who wasn't on Facebook, didn't have an account. So this is a company that has huge, and the way in which it chooses to curate its platform has huge implications for us all. Sorry,
Thank
I'm
you.
rambling.
No, it's a very chilling example of some of the issues you're dealing with. So just two very brief questions before we open it up. The first is about how do the technology companies view you and respond? Do they see you as irritation or a challenge to their business model? Because presumably there's no intent for them to see these consequences occur, but it's more about the cost of having to do something about it. So what are the conversations like between you and them?
Yeah.
Or your lawyers and their lawyers?
That's a great question. You would hope that when these things were highlighted to the corporation, because as you say, I'm sure there are very good people working in there, that they would make choices that would change the way in which they curated their platforms. Very sadly, our experience to date has not been that. In stark contrast to the government, actually, and it's interesting, though, the cases we've taken against the UK government when an algorithm or the use of data has come to light. So, for example, we took a case against the Home Office because it was using an algorithm that was just overtly racist against some nationalities. The government, once it was highlighted, they disclosed it all to us, they then removed the algorithm. And similarly, we took the case against the A-level algorithm, because that was also inherently biased. And once it was highlighted, and perhaps also because the head of Eton wrote to Boris Johnson, perhaps as well as the legal challenge, the government also withdrew that algorithm. So what's interesting is in the terms of the UK government, there has been once something has come to light, and it's always, sadly, often been, again, a whistleblower who's brought it to light, because there is a lack of transparency by the government in terms of the use of this technology. But in terms of the cases that we've taken, they've never ended up in a full substantial hearing because the government has chosen not to kind of argue the point. The companies are very different. So Meta, in the cases, we've got these 3 cases in Kenya, and what we are asking for is a right for content moderators to join a union and for them to get proper psychological and psychiatric support and healthcare. So just to explain what a content moderator's day is like, you arrive at work, you spend 8 hours in front of a Facebook kind of internal platform where you are asked to moderate the most toxic content you can imagine. So children being raped, people being beheaded live. You just have this for 8 to 10 hours, that's all you look at. And of course what happens is you are massively psychologically damaged. Like, how could you not be? If I saw one person being beheaded live, that would scar me for life. These are young graduates who think they're coming into a job that, with Facebook. This is suddenly a career kind of potential here, and they are paid woefully less than $2 an hour for this incredibly skilled work. Like, whether something should stay on the platform or not is tricky. Like, there are obviously kind of extreme examples where you just automatically take them off. But actually the skilled work of what should stay on and what shouldn't, people like me, lawyers, would get paid huge amounts of money for that discussion about freedom of speech.
But you're saying the companies are just not responding in the way you would have hoped.
So what Meta, let me keep on to the point. What Meta, I get too passionate about it. But what happened in Kenya is that Meta has come in and said that the Kenyan courts have no jurisdiction over the company. So they are saying that they don't have an office in Kenya, and as a result of the fact they don't have an office, they don't do business in Kenya, even though there is clearly Facebook in Kenya. It's a platform that everyone accesses. They make money out of it through advertising. They are arguing that the courts have no role over the way in which the company behaves in that country. I mean, that is extraordinary. And they won't even engage in any of the substantive issues. And this is a company which is, just so profitable, and clearly the content moderators are the absolute hub of their business model, and they should be paid appropriately for the skilled work they do.
I'm sure that a lot of people would agree with you, and thank you for giving us that window into the world of your day-to-day work, challenging these companies and some of their practices. Just one other question, turning to philanthropy. So what does this all have to do with philanthropy? Well, your organisation is philanthropy backed. There's been, surprisingly, some enlightened funders that are willing to get involved in what might seem like an unusual area of philanthropy, which is supporting organisations taking legal action. So could you say a little bit about the conversations you've with funders in the philanthropic world and where you see the opportunities for them to support some of this work?
Sure. So as you say, we have had the kind of benefit and privilege of huge amount, really extraordinary support from all of the different foundations.
Which are some of the ones that have been supporting you?
Luminate, OSF, Joseph Rowntree, the Barry Cadbury, and then also individuals. We have individuals who will kind of log £5 a month, which is incredibly heartwarming as well. I'll be really honest. I think I guess two things that I think have been quite hard for us to persuade foundations to fund. Workers' rights, I feel like we are now there, but it's taken us a year and a half to really persuade different foundations to back the work. We had to do the first year of work. We basically had to pay the Kenyan lawyer out of our core funding. We couldn't get any project-based work to do the workers' rights issues through litigation. I think that has now changed. We spent a lot of time talking to the different foundations, the different people involved, trying to explain why we thought it was so important in terms of challenging the power of the corporations. And I think when you look through history, the role of unions is so crucial. You look at farming or oil industry, the role of unions really is crucial to trying to change the way in which these companies behave and the exploitation and abuse they have of their workers. So I think that's changed, for which we're extremely grateful, and we hope that will continue. I think the other thing to say is I think there is a hesitation about litigation. I don't know why, but then I'm obviously biased because I'm a litigator. I think that's also beginning to change, but we've definitely found, we wanted to hold a meeting in order to help create a union in Kenya for the content moderators. And getting funding for that piece of work, for example, was much easier than getting funding to actually sue Meta. And they're both obviously very important, but actually it feels to us that space for litigation is really important, and actually companies hate it. And that tells you something, because there is that the court process, although far from the kind of panacea of all justice, is a really important forum, not only in terms of that kind of moral play, but also it creates a space publicly to have these conversations. I mean, suddenly, when we started this work, we would enter into every room and kind of explain what content moderation is. I think now that really has changed, and over the course of the kind of cases and other work people have been doing, there is now much greater awareness, because there is, I think, an interest in that litigation from a public conversation, because you're having the debate in public. There is a way in which the company can't run away from you, or the government can't run away from you. You're stuck in that room, and you're arguing about whether people should be able to join a union or not. And that public conversation, that public exposure, I think is a really, really important.
Yeah. It does seem a very interesting use of private philanthropy for the public space and the public square, or the digital public square, and the protection and advancement of that space. So thank you for that overview of your work. I mean, we've heard two really interesting but complementary but very different portraits of philanthropy's involvement in these issues, from a kind of more functional view about the role of technology in society to taking on the abuses that are associated with some of these practices. So thank you both of you. I want to open the conversation up to all of you here for your thoughts and questions. Please do put your hand up and introduce yourselves. And we can put your thoughts and questions, or that you have, if you have them, to Rosa and Tim. Does anyone want to kick off? I'm sure there's lots on your minds listening as I've been to these presentations. I can see one hand there. Let's see if I can get a couple more. And we'll start with you in a moment, Samira. Are there any other questions on people's minds? Second hand there. I'm just looking for a third hand on someone. This is a great opportunity to quiz people that are intimately involved in these issues in a third hand here. Thank you, Daniel. So we'll start with Samira. Introduce yourself, Samira. And raise your voice as well.
I'm Samira Wing. So a question for each. Rosa, what role do you see for local governance models and frameworks in applying pressure in the example that you shared about Kenya? Even if they're not based there, they're headquartered in another country that's signed up to these principles. So how do you leverage some of those? You mentioned the lack of intersectionality that you see across certain areas. What is the role of philanthropy in encouraging, in creating space, and investing in bringing those intersected or cross-sectoral collaborations?
Did you catch that? Great. Have your question. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Diana. I'm with The Connection. My question is for Rosa. I wonder what kind of language did you then use compared to trying to get funding to sue or litigate Meta compared to trying to get funding for getting the Kenyan workers part of a union, and how is the language different, and did you then also know that the funding would be used for Meta as well or not, and is it restricted? I'm just wondering about the narrative that you use for both of them.
Thank you. And
Hi, I'm Daniel from SAPA, an impact intermediary in the Global South. Obviously, the corporates here hold all or most of the power in this debate, and we heard from Rosa how she's engaging with them. And I'm curious, Tim, do you work with those big tech companies as well, or try to engage them, and if so, what's the response been in your...
Thank you. Start with you, Tim.
Pick up that last question first. We are UK focused in all our funding, and we certainly wouldn't take money into Ada from them. I mean, I think one of the important things about setting up Ada was we made it absolutely clear we were independent of industry, independent of government. That was the point of being a foundation.
And please speak up.
I think it's quite interesting how, well, as I listen to Rosa, and it takes a bit of Samira's question too, I think. When I spoke, I said, in slightly, not to my consternation, but I noticed how Ada had inevitably gone into the elite discussions about AI and government regulation. And maybe one should start where people's experience was. On the other hand, the issues of regulation are so complex, and the legal issues are so fraught, and the issues of traction and jurisdiction are so disputed, that the power of independent institutes holding people to account requires you absolutely being on top of that sort of technical detail. And so I think one of the great successes of Ada was getting really into the European Parliament and then into the Commission to get some very particular wording into the protocols and things that came through Europe, which the big tech companies hated. Similarly, actually, going back to something else Rosa said, actually the UK government does listen to these things. Regulation in this area is really, really hard. And one of the things regulators don't want to do is to be given powers or given responsibilities without powers. So they're told to sort something, but they can't do anything about them because that just makes them look failed. And I was a regulator at one stage at Ofcom before all this took off. And even at that stage, one saw a gap between Ofcom's jurisdiction, the ICO's jurisdiction, where all the bad stuff happened. So it's a really difficult issue. So I think one of the things that independent funding does is it allows the expertise and the brain power to wrestle on the same terms with the vast amount of wealth being put in by corporate lawyers and government civil servants just trying to find a way through this, to actually try and get some wins in particular areas. So I think that's why, in the end, you have to be prepared to be in there, in the centres of power, and not just shouting from the outside, which is parallel in a way to litigation and going into the courts to get the same things done. So I think we were saying rather similar things. So I think that's my answer.
Thanks. Do you want to respond to any of the other questions or points? Or?
I thought that point about intersectionality is a really good point, actually. one of the benefits, I think, of independent agents in this area is convening, is actually getting people from different experiences and different trajectories into the same place and trying to hammer out some points from which at least a discussion can begin. And it's very difficult to get the big players into the room. People at Amazon just won't play at all, unless you found otherwise.
No, definitely no.
But it's quite interesting how, and then the question is, in terms of research, how do you play with people like Meta? I mean, some of the most original research in America is Raj Chetty's work from Chicago on social capital using Facebook data. And the battles there for the independent use of that data and Facebook's regulation of it is another story. But the point about the data that these big companies hold, if opened up to impartial empirical researchers, could bring huge benefits. So I think the combination of driving research into policy and into practice, and getting the practitioners at the table too, is really important. And if you don't have that sort of intersectionality, you can do research and you can produce publications that may make you feel better for having done so, but they just don't have the impact and effectiveness they should.
And research is necessary but not sufficient, which is why it's heartening. There's also the legal actions, people to take them as well. So, Rosa, bringing you in, do you want to respond to some of the questions?
I think that the heart of your question is a question about regulation of the companies. There's a Supreme Court judge in the US who very famously says we may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And the way in which Foxglove has been trying to think about, in essence, the monopolies of the big tech companies, of these handful of companies, is to try and think about how you regulate it through competition law and how you make sure that the people who are working in those companies have the powers to demand change within it. And I think it has to be both. And so one of the kind of spaces that I think is not used by civil society enough and becomes very, very technocratic in the way that you've been describing, and trying to bust out of that technocratic language has definitely been a still work in progress, is competition law.
Yeah.
Because actually another myth about these companies is they're innovating constantly. Actually what they're doing is they are buying constantly. They're buying every single small company up and all of the ideas those companies have created. And what's incredibly clear is that there has been an absolute lack of regulation and a lack of preventing these companies from getting bigger, let alone busting them up. And to be frank, they need to be busted up. They are too big. And so in terms of what the regulators could do here in the UK, in Europe, in the US, and we obviously see an amazing movement by Lina Khan in the US trying to use trust laws to bring about some of the kind of, really busting up those companies. And we don't yet see here, let's be frank, and we don't yet see in Europe. That feels incredibly important because the size of the company really matters. In terms of the regulations in Kenya, similarly, there's an amazing kind of group, again, trying to use competition law. There are various different countries, African countries, who've come together to try and think about ways in which they can tackle big tech. And I hope they will be kind of inspired by the Lina Khan movement in the US to try and do that. In terms of Facebook's argument that the rule of law doesn't apply to them in Kenya, to be frank, it is... trying to think of a polite word.
Yeah, you don't need to be polite.
It's bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. This is a company that operates in Kenya, and of course the rule of law operates in it too. And I think in a way, as always, what the company is trying to do is to be frank, starve the petitioners out of the case. So one of the arguments in that case is to do with, in essence, it was a sham. There was a mass sacking, which they pretended was a sham redundancy. And we managed to get an injunction from the court saying that, in fact, people could not lose their jobs until the entire case was over, and their salaries needed to be paid. Just remember, these salaries are tiny. And Facebook to date, despite that court ruling, has not paid the salaries. And so they are they have so much money that they can argue every single little point. And the point about jurisdiction will go all the way up to the Supreme Court, I suspect, because we've won every point so far, and they are appealing every point so far. And so we will end up in the Supreme Court, I suspect, on that jurisdiction point too. But I certainly hope that the Kenyan judiciary will find in our favour that, of course, if a company is operating in the country, they have to abide by the Kenyan rule of law. That goes without saying. So I certainly hope that regulation and governance will take place through the jurisdiction of the courts if needed, but also through the Kenyan government themselves taking steps to regulate.
And do you want to just say a brief word about language?
So what we ended up doing, because we couldn't get that kind of restricted project funding for litigation, we ended up basically using all of the core funding, to try and to do the funding for the litigation. While, to be honest, we ended up having a whole series of different conversations with people who were working at the different kind of foundations and trusts to try and argue why we thought it was so important. We were very open about the fact that we were using our core funding to pay for the Kenyan lawyers involved, and we tried to show in a way through our action why it was so important they gave us kind of specific funding for it. So that was it was less the kind of different change in language. We tried to almost we tried to act and show the point in the hope that it would change kind of to a different decision-making process, which thankfully, it did. So we're really grateful for that.
And we'll take another round of questions. There anyone else? We've got one there. Anyone on this table? Try and get one from each table. One here. And anyone else on this table? If not, Caroline, you can ask questions as well. So we'll go from there. So we've got two on this table, then Anne-Marie, then Caroline.
Caroline Goldman, I'm Harriet Rowe Advisors, and I'm a trustee at Philanthropy. A question on embedding. So I've done some work recently with people that are concerned about embedding AI in medicine, because a lot of the data that is being swept up in the back is by people who are currently using telemedicine. People who are currently using telemedicine are people who are wealthy enough to be able to afford to be using telemedicine. So actually you're kind of embedding answers to medical questions from a population that is not reflective of the entire population. Do you see movements around this in your field? Do you see people pushing back or regulating? Because it potentially has huge consequences as to, as medicine moves more towards this way, what happens to people that are not part of that data set?
Thank you. Your question?
Hi, I'm Caroline Rose from Mercer. You used the term technocratic language, and I was wondering if you could give a bit more cover to that.
Technocratic language. Come back to that in a moment. Anne-Marie?
Sure. So a question from Rosa. Hi, by the way, I'm Anne-Marie from Alliance Magazine. I'm just thinking about the hypocrisy really of Meta kind of treating its workers this way when Mark Zuckerberg has pledged to give away 99% of his wealth, and he talks a lot about the Zuckerberg Chan initiative, and he's kind of big into philanthropy. So I was just wondering what your opinions are on that, and whether Meta's attitude towards this is like a top-down thing. Does Zuckerberg really have that much control anymore over what Meta does, or is the company so decentralized that it's actually not much to do with Zuckerberg anymore?
Great question. Thank you. And Caroline, back to you.
Yeah, this is not a question at all. It's just an example that I wanted to throw in, because there's presumably a lot of people in foundations in this room and on this webinar. And one of my all-time, so part of your question was about how can philanthropy help in these kinds of cases where someone needs to sue a company. And one of my all-time favourite examples of effective philanthropy is where, I can't name them for obvious reasons, but there was a charity which is a campaigning charity in this country, and in pursuit of their campaign they needed to sue a very large company, and the very large, the other way around, they had to expose some stuff about this company, and the company threatened to sue them, and that would have destroyed the charity. And as you know, in UK law, that they would have been able to go after the charity's trustees. And this little charity one of its backers is a multi-billion-dollar foundation, and they said, okay, we'll stand behind you and we'll take that risk. So if you take this case and it fails, then we will cover, we will pay up for you. And so the company was threatening to sue this charity precisely because they knew that it was an existential risk to that charity. And the fact that there was this backer, this foundation, stood behind its grantee and basically made its balance sheet available, like a sort of loan guarantee, meant that the charity didn't have to back down, and it could take the case, and that made the company back down, which meant that the campaign was able to succeed and meet its goals. And I just throw that out as an amazing example of philanthropy, of big foundations being able to enable very substantial change without, in this case, having to spend a dime.
Fascinating example. Thank you for bringing that in, and thanks for all your questions. Let's go to Tim first, and then Rosa.
I'm going to pick up that question about medicine, actually, which isn't an area I know much about. I don't know much about AI, for that matter. But I think there's a danger in the sort of conversation we're having that it becomes lots of wicked people doing wicked things. There are lots of wicked people doing wicked things, but there always are. The point about these technologies, they are going to change every aspect of our lives and of our society and how it operates and how public good and public benefit is delivered. And you can't just see that in terms of lots of wicked people. It is perfectly true that the extraordinary power of these companies and their regulatory structures is something we have not seen in this way, well, not since probably the railways in America in the late 19th century, and this is exponentially more significant. But if you take, the point you make about medicine is a really classic double-edged sword. You know, essentially, artificial intelligence is making brain surgery incredibly more accurate at the moment. You know, the benefits this brings. Similarly, when people get worried about AI making decisions as opposed to human agency making decisions, it can often not look at the mistakes that human agency makes. In the courts, for instance, we're more comfortable with human beings making decisions. Often those decisions, particularly in very technical cases, can be very flawed, as we know. But then on the other hand, and this is the key point you made, the data sets being used, and that's the real issue, can lead to structural harms. And UK Biobank, I think is what you're referring to, you know, where over 90% of the data is actually indigenous white Britain, means that it's very valuable data, but within it there are whole invisible communities that are not there, which we may not know about, and equally where certain actions and proposals emerging from that data could be damaging to those communities. And so I think the issue of the complexity of the data sets and the danger of a sort of techno-solutionism, because we've got this, we can do that, that's the tricky bit. I mean, the way that Fran Bennett, who's one of the key people at Ada, puts it, you know, and actually Rosa's been going through a lot of this today. If you look at the harms, AI has, you have to start with AI can bring extraordinary benefits. Without this technology, you know, it's unlikely that the key issues that we have to address in the world can be fixed. So you can't just say it's a bad thing, we wish it wasn't there. But the harms are supply chain harms, which we're talking about in Kenya. They are accidental harms, which are things like discrimination, shifting job applications because people haven't got the data sets right. There are misuse harms, some of which we've been hearing about, and the danger of generative AI in those. But then there are these structural or systemic harms, which come from the way the economy and you know, market concentration, misinformation, begin to just warp things. So I think we've got, as we think about what we can do as independent philanthropic organisations, is that independence is really important to give people the agency to reframe some of these arguments, to get the information to make us think differently and find the right challenges. Because this is just complicated. And I think it's as dangerous to say, you can get yourself into a default position where you can do a lot of identifying the harms, but then the question is, how do you find a way through it?
Thank you.
So to pick up on that, to explain why we called ourselves Foxglove, We called ourselves Foxglove because it is a plant that is obviously both potentially medicinal and also poisonous. And that's what we think about technology. Actually, there can be some really wonderful things that come from it, but actually we need to make sure that it doesn't cause some of the harms that we're seeing. And maybe to pick up a little bit on the health data, because we've been doing some work about NHS data and how it kind of moves around the system and how crucial it is that the NHS data is used better. Like, everyone we speak to within the health profession says it's not used in the best way possible and it could be much more efficient. I think we all probably have kind of anecdotal evidence ourselves of, like, Corrie has this very kind of, she always has this kind of infamous story that's now...
Corrie, your co-founder.
My co-founder, where she had to have a test because there was something on her skin, and it was actually quickest for her to cycle the result, like her test results from her hospital to her GP herself. That would have taken 22 minutes. Otherwise, it was going to take about 5 days. So clearly there's a problem. I think what feels such a shame is that, and one of the kind of worries that we have, is what the government's done in response to that is they have done several attempts to try and kind of create either centralised pools of NHS data or create better kind of ways in which data flows. They've done that in a way that has not been transparent, and they've done that in a way which, very sadly, I think, is causing people to feel anxious about it. So their latest kind of form of that is something called the Federated Data Platform, and unfortunately they've chosen a company which has a very, seems to us as a very odd choice of an NHS partner. It's a company that is most well known for its involvement in extrajudicial killing in Pakistan,
This is Palantir.
And separating families at the US-Mexico border. So that feels like a very odd partner to the NHS. But anyway, they've won the contract. But what the government could now clearly do is give a very clear guarantee to people that the data that they are kind of centralising and flowing in a different way will not be given access to private companies or to other government departments without the most explicit individual consent for that particular use. Like, that's something which is in the government's gift. I think if people, if people were told that, they wouldn't be feeling anxious about the fact that there's going to be this new use of data, a new way in which data is going to be handled and processed. And we see people are very worried because obviously it's the most confidential data, like the whole cornerstone of the National Health Service is based on this relationship of trust and privacy between you and your practitioner. And without those guarantees, we see people worrying about what it is that Palantir is going to be doing, what's this centralised data, who's going to have access to it, for what reason. People are anxious, they then opt out. They opt out through the National Data Opt-out. This is not good for our health service, for our public health service. And actually, it's totally within the gift of the government to now give us that cast iron guarantee. And it's so stark to me and telling that they won't do that. And why won't they do that? Is it because there is a risk?
Why do you think they won't do it?
I mean,
is this about the influence of companies on government?
I genuinely don't know, Charles. I think the anxiety is that there is a kind of... We know that NHS data is the most valuable medical data for big tech. Like, it's got the richest depth and wealth of kind of medical data, which is machine readable. And we know, Google, Alphabet, everybody would like to get their mitts on it. I don't know if that's where they're headed, but they clearly have a choice to not do that. And they clearly have a choice to give us all that guarantee and to give us that trust. So actually we feel at ease with the fact that data will flow more easily. Like, there are clearly benefits to it. And I think it's such a good example of where actually government intervening, providing that assurance, would mean that data could be used better and AI could be used better than the health service. That wasn't even the question I was supposed to answer, sorry.
Could you answer the one? Could you answer, yes, the Chan Zuckerberg initiative is aiming to eradicate diseases. And there's a hospital that bears the name of Mark Zuckerberg, I believe, in San Francisco, and a host of other philanthropic initiatives that he's involved in. And yet, for you, from the lens in which you're seeing him, is through these harms. So how do you square that circle?
So, hypocrisy, I think, is a good word. In terms of, you asked about how much the kind of people at the top know. One of the things that, again, the Facebook files revealed through Francis was that there was They do know, for sure. There have been various memos that have been sent up to the absolute top, including Mark, talking about the horrific impact of the lack of content moderation has on communities, particularly in the rest of the world. They knew what was happening in Ethiopia. To give you a very stark example, with the US Capitol Hill riots on January the 6th, Facebook within 3 hours changed their software. They changed their software to reduce, to remove, and to prevent the kind of sharing of the most inciting and violent content. They did that for US users, and it had an impact, and their documents show that. The riots were awful. Ethiopia, 600,000 people have died, and Facebook have chosen to take none of those steps over the course of 2 years that they took in 3 hours for US users. They haven't done the Ethiopian users. Like, this is all, these are corporate conscious decisions. And while there may be an attempt to kind of wash away those harms and abuses through the kind of philanthropic giving, I think it's incredibly important that no one loses sight of what's happening in their own company and in their own backyard. And I think their attempts, for me, that is clear. I mean, there may be some wonderful things that happen as a result of that money, and I mean, I'm sure there will be, but there should be a spotlight on what the company is doing to their own employees and their own content moderators, in my view.
And those are bigger questions about the legitimacy of philanthropy, the relationship between the sources of wealth and the behaviour of the companies and the families that generate that wealth, which is maybe a conversation for another day, but I'm really glad that it's been serviced, because I think it is a question that we do see raised in relation to our field. I'd like to give an opportunity for some closing words from Tim, and so over to you,
We've
Tim.
talked about an awful lot. And I'm not going to try and pull it together, except to say that I think there are so many...
And speak up.
The challenges of artificial intelligence are so multidimensional and affect every aspect of public life and private life. So the importance, I think, of independent philanthropy is to create space against institutional interests which will dominate this conversation. I think one of the most interesting and worrying aspects of the digitization of our society is we have replaced what used to be civic networks with social networks. So we have a myriad of social networks, but there's no civic space, much less. In the days when there was public service broadcasting, in the linear world of broadcasting, there was such a space, but there isn't anymore. So I think actually one of the roles that we can play is to try and make room for that civic space, places where these things can be laid out. The one area we haven't talked about, which I'd just like to throw into the conversation, because again, a lot of foundations have this absolutely at their core, is the impact of AI on education and educational opportunities, and how that plays out. And there's a lot of talk about it, there's very little research going on about it, and it could be extraordinarily enabling and empowering, and give access to educational tools that people in disadvantaged situations across the world and within UK society have not had. Or it could be very dangerously codifying and excluding. And the question of what should and how we teach in schools, what is it that young people, particularly in a world of increasing inequality, increasing vulnerability, increasing mental health problems, will need to know, and what we'll need to know about them, and how is that equitably structured, as in their pathways from education to the world of work, whatever the world of work will be. I think that is one of the really important questions, where, again, you can find a whole lot of people getting to first base in the conversations. But I don't yet see the big projects for thinking that through. One can hear and see of chilling things in China, the use of AI to monitor every child all the time in the classrooms and grade them according to every flicker of their eyeballs. You can see complete lunacies in the States where schools pick up pieces of software which are sold to them by dodgy people about how gait recognition software can identify potential active shooters in the kids going into the classrooms. There's a real danger too, I think, that private actors in the education space will capture the data of children without anyone being aware that's happening. But equally is the case of how these technologies are going to be used and how can they be used to really give opportunities for wisdom and insight and skills which otherwise children won't have. Someone said to me the problem is that the poorer sections of society will not have access to AI. Somebody later said to me, no, it's the other way around, that AI tools will be used to be the bog standard education for everyone, and access to a human teacher will only be for the elite. Now, which way, we don't know. But that's the sort of thing we need to be finding out. And I think that's a critical area which we shouldn't ignore.
Thank you, and that's a very poignant and profound note to end on. And health and education, as you all know here, are two of the biggest destinations for philanthropic funding. But the intersection of those cause areas with the issues we're discussing today is maybe something that warrants further investigation and discussion, and I very much hope, I'm sure I'm not only speaking for myself, there will be foundations like the Nuffield Foundation and others that will be trying to call attention and send resources into those areas. I want to thank Rosa and Tim in particular for joining us today for your expertise. It's been really illuminating. We decided to focus the conversation on these topics, sadly because of the absence of our other panellists, but we will return to issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, the questions about diversifying boards, confronting colonial legacies, questions around racial justice, grant making, which are also big themes in the year in philanthropy that we've just had. But I hope you've felt it's been useful to spend the last hour or so talking about artificial intelligence, new technologies, and the impact for philanthropy. There's clearly a lot more that can be and will be said. For those that are joining via the live stream, you'll receive a video of the event next week via email and a write-up, together with details of how you can subscribe and be part of the Alliance community. And for everyone here in London, it's time, very fittingly, for tea. And our workshop looking at the year in philanthropy through our special features will commence out in half an hour at 3 p.m. So look forward to seeing you back in half an hour. But to end, thank you all of you for being part of this discussion this afternoon. Thank you. Because we did. If there had been certain people in the room that could have pulled up on, I would have done that, but I actually think it was a much richer conversation.
Neither party would be satisfied.
That's interesting, yeah. Yeah.